Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me. I'm glad to be hosting this week's seminar. I'm really glad to introduce Dheeraj Chowdhury, who's presenting a project that we've talked on and off about this project a little bit over the last couple of years, just like occasional emails. And so I'm really excited to see him present it, looking at the impacts of declining trade costs in the railroads on inequality. The format of the seminar is going to be, so for 40 minutes, Dheeraj is going to present sort of relatively, he's going to present uninterrupted, but you can accumulate questions in the Q&A. And so if you put your questions there, then for the last 20 minutes, we'll sort of collect those questions and I'll summarize some of them, add some questions. And, if it's for some particularly lengthy questions, maybe you can unmute yourself. And then, so after that hour, we'll finish the sort of initial portion of the seminar. And then, for those of you that want, you can stick around for an additional sort of more informal 15 minutes for just sort of more discussion amongst ourselves. So Dheeraj, do you want to share your slides and take it away?
Thank you, Rick. Thank you, Rui and Nathan, for inviting me to this seminar. And I'm really excited about this. And thank you, everyone, for attending this talk. As Rick mentioned, this paper is about trade cost and wealth inequality and the role of financial development in mediating the effect of trade costs on wealth inequality. And this paper is based in history and it has both empirical and theoretical component. And let me just start. So the broad motivation for this paper is that over the last 40 years, both income and wealth inequality in the US have increased dramatically. For instance, the wealth share of the top 10% has increased from around 63% in the mid-1980s to over 77% today. There's a large debate about the factors that have contributed to this rise in inequality. And this debate revolves around factors such as skill-based technical change, increased globalization, declining tax progressivity, or the emergence of superstar firms, to name a few. What I do in this paper is I revisit this debate by studying the distributional consequences of lower trade cost by exploiting a very unique, large historical episode. In particular, I look at the expansion of the railroad network in the 19th century US as a shock to trade costs. And I ask the following two questions. Number one, what is the impact of lower trade costs on wealth inequality? So we know about the effect of trade costs on inequality and other things, but this would be the first paper that empirically studies the effect of trade costs on wealth inequality. And in this paper, I also study to what extent the level of financial development matters for the distributional consequences of declining trade barriers. And I answer these questions in this paper using both empirical and theoretical methods. So let me start by giving you a brief idea of the empirics. As I mentioned before, this paper is rooted in history. And so let me just give you some idea why this is a very good setting to answer this question. Number one, the railroad expansion in the 19th century US is a very large-scale natural experiment, and railroads reduce the cost of shipping goods across the country significantly. And the second reason that I look at this question using historical context is that the availability of wealth data. From 1850 to 1870, the census collected data on wealth holdings for everyone in the US. So in this sense, I have the universe of wealth data for around 16 million households and basically the entirety of population. And this data is even not available now. So that's for these two reasons, this setting is a very good setting to study the impact of trade costs on wealth inequality. So armed with this universe of wealth data and large decline in trade costs, I conduct my analysis at the county level and study the effect of changes in county market access that are generated by expanding railroads on county level wealth inequality. And to do this, I built very heavily on Rick's work. And basically, what is county market access? I'll talk about this in detail later, but briefly, county market access captures how cheaply goods can be transported from a county to all other US counties. So if a producer in a county can access larger markets at a cheaper cost, then that county would have a higher market access. And since railroads reduce the cost of shipping within the country, they increase the market access for all US counties. And for identification, I rely on the observation that the variation in counties' market access is largely determined by the expansion of the railroads outside the county rather than within county construction that could potentially be endogenous. I'll discuss this in detail later. Let me just give you a preview of my empirical results. So the headline result is that a 1 standard deviation in county market access leads on average to a 3.2 percentage point increase in the real estate wealth share of the top 10% in that county. So this is the main result. And the second result that studies the sensitivity of inequality to trade costs, I find that the effect of lower trade cost on wealth inequality are slightly muted in areas with higher financial development or in areas where banking system is relatively more developed. So this is the empirics, and to rationalize this result, I write a quantitative model. So this is a very simple small open economy model. It's a dynamic Mallet's model, which has basically 4 key features. Number one, heterogeneous households. That is, households are heterogeneous in their entrepreneurial productivity. Second, occupational choice. Households every period can choose to become entrepreneurs, or they can choose to remain workers by paying a per period fixed cost. And number 3, financial frictions. Households can be financially constrained in expanding their scale of production. And finally, trade. So agents in this small open economy can trade with the rest of the country. And so this is, you can just think of it as a dynamic Mallet's model where every firm is owned by a household who makes consumption saving decisions and can potentially be financially constrained. I do not model railroads, but in this framework, railroads are simply a device that lead to a decline in iceberg trade costs. So I calibrate this small open economy or this representative county to match key data features of the 1850 US. And then I feed in the empirically observed decline in trade costs and study what happens in this model economy. So the model results suggest that lowering trade barriers leads to an increase in income and wealth. That is, higher trade is good for growth, but I also find that this growth comes at the cost of higher inequality, both income and wealth. In terms of magnitude, I find that when I feed in the empirically observed decline in trade cost in my calibrated model, the decline in trade cost can explain about 60% of the observed increase in the top 10% wealth share between 1850 and 1870. So before moving on, I would like to give you a brief idea, like through what mechanisms lower trade costs are affecting wealth inequality. So in my model, I have 2 key mechanisms through which trade costs impact wealth inequality, and I also verify these mechanisms in the empirical data. So the first mechanism is simply that lowering trade barriers leads to a reallocation of resources towards wealthier households. So how does it happen? So it's basically simply a Mallet's story. Declining trade barriers in a county provide entrepreneurs with a larger exporting opportunities outside, and this leads to selection of more productive or wealthier entrepreneurs into exporting, and thus they benefit relatively more. At the same time, this leads to a higher economic activity in the county, and this pushes the marginal cost up, pushes wages up, and these GE effects force the least productive entrepreneurs who were marginally profitable in the high trade cost economy to exit. So this selection mechanism reallocates market shares and thus incomes towards more productive or wealthier households. And over time, with dynamic capital accumulation, this leads to an increase in wealth inequality. So there is nothing special about this mechanism. This is basically a manifestation of Mallet's model in a dynamic sense. And this is an efficient outcome to lowering trade barriers. So the second part that is more interesting is that the level of financial development can interact with how trade costs affect wealth inequality. In particular, I find that financial constraint can exacerbate the effect of declining trade barriers on wealth inequality. So these credit frictions limit relatively poor households from taking advantage of these new economic opportunities that are provided by this outside market that they are not able to access. These poor households due to the constraint they face, are unable to enter the product market or the export market. And even when they can enter these product or export market, they operate at a suboptimal scale because they do not have enough net worth to increase their production of scale that is demanded by this outside new economic opportunities. I'm going to skip this slide. Just let me just point out two things. So this is the first paper to study the effect of trade costs on wealth inequality. And second, there's a large and new interesting literature like revived by Rick's work. And in this framework, I try to contribute to study the distributional effects of railroads as opposed to the growth and productivity effects that they are after. So the outline of the talk is as follows. I will talk about aggregate trends and then I'll show you my empirical analysis, and then I'll show you my model and then model counterfactuals. So over the 19th century, the railroad network expanded in the US rapidly. In 1850, only 9,000 miles of track is there, and most of this track is in the northeast of the US. And by 1860, the railroads reached the Midwest, and by 1870, around 50,000 miles of track is built, and the railroads connected the East United States to the West United States with the completion of transcontinental railroad. So there is a large debate, historical debate about the role of railroads in contributing to the US economic growth. And it's a huge literature. But at the same time, both income and wealth inequality in the US also increased during this period. For example, Linden and Williamson, they report that the income share of the top 10% increased from around 36.5% to almost 41% by the end of the century, in the last half century. And I also find that real estate wealth share of top 10% also increased by approximately 3.4 percentage point between 1850 and 1870. Piketty and Size also find that in the second half of this century, the wealth share of top 10% also increased. And so at a time when railroads are expanding, US economy is growing, and both income and wealth inequality are also increasing. My paper tries to quantify the effect of railroads on wealth inequality. And let me just tell you a bit more about my data and empirical analysis. For my analysis, I rely on several data sources, and one of the main one is the data on wealth inequality. And the source is the US Census recently digitized complete count schedules available from EPIMS. And so this data provides from 1850 to 1870, the real estate wealth for every individual in the US, and personal wealth for 1860 to 1870, for 2 decades only. So census enumerators went from house to house and collected data on household level wealth holdings, although data is supposed to be individual level, but historical accounts suggest that census enumerators only collected on household level wealth holdings. So they went to a house, and most of the times household had reported all of the wealth in his name. So that's why I conduct the analysis at the household level. And although I have data on both real estate wealth and personal wealth, I rely on real estate wealth for 3 reasons as my main outcome variable. First, it is available for all 3 decades. Second, personal wealth is marred by the emancipation. So in southern states, personal wealth included wealth held in slaves. And in 1860, that wealth is gone. And finally, personal wealth also has some issues with censoring from below. So there are some measurement concerns. So I'll show my main results using real estate wealth as my main measure, but I show the robustness that my results also hold for personal wealth. So from this data, I create county level measures of wealth inequality, such as the top 10% share and the Gini coefficient. For market access, I rely entirely on Rick's work. So they provide county to county trade costs data for the entire decade. So I don't have to calculate this part. And using county level population and other estimates, I can calculate market access that I'll talk later. And for financial development, I rely on state level census data from the United States from 1850. And I have 3 indicators: per capita number of banks, per capita bank loans, and per capita bank capital. So in total, my final sample has data on around 16 million households in approximately 2,200 counties and from 1850 to 1870. For consistency, county borders are kept constant at 1890 levels. So what is market access and why are railroads important? Railroads are important because they led to huge declines in trade cost. Fogel estimated that per ton mile cost of shipping is 0.63 cents for railroads as opposed to 23.1 cents for wagon. So railroads are an order of magnitude cheaper than the alternative main source of transportation, that is transporting goods by wagons. Water transportation is somewhat cheaper, but the sparse network of rivers and canals does not make it compete with the railroads. So to study the impact of decline in trade cost, I create a county level measure of average trade cost that I call market access following Rick's work. And what is market access? Market access captures how cheaply goods can be transported from that county to all other US counties. And algebraically, market access is the weighted sum over the cost of shipping goods from that county to all other counties, weighted by other counties' population. So if producers in a county can access larger markets, that is if LD is higher, then the market access would be higher and tau transporting cost appears negatively with adjusted by trade elasticity. So since railroads reduce the cost of shipping goods, they increase the market access for all counties. So to study the impact of market access, which are basically average trade cost, I consider the following specification where I regress the county level inequality measures on county market access after controlling for county fixed effect, state time fixed effect, and county other geographic fixed effect. So the identification assumption is that I basically compare the effect on inequality when changes market access among nearby counties. And the main coefficient is beta 1, which captures the sensitivity of wealth inequality to market access. So if beta 1 is positive, that suggests that higher market access leads to an increase in wealth inequality. Obviously, there are concerns about identification that if a county is growing unequally for some other reason, and then growing county can also attract railroads, then there would be identification concerns to account for that. So basically market access can go up for two reasons, like local railroad construction, which is endogenous, as I mentioned, and second is outside railroad construction. So you can imagine construction of railroads outside the county, and the county benefits through its position in the existing transportation network. To give you an example, you can imagine the construction of transcontinental railroad, which has nothing to do with any county's local economic conditions in New York or Maryland, but the market access for these counties will also go up because producers in these counties can now export their goods to the entire Western market. And therefore, I also find that the large variation in counties market access due to this outside construction rather than the railroad construction within the county. And to check for that, I follow the literature, and for endogenous component, I directly control flexibly for local railroads in terms of cubic mileage, so that I'm only capturing the effect of outside railroad construction. So the baseline results are this. So a one increase in market access leads to an increase in wealth inequality measured by an indicator in terms of magnitude. I find that a 1 log point increase in market access leads to a 2.32 percentage point increase in the real estate wealth share of the top 10%. And for 1 log point increase in market access, the Gini coefficient also goes up by 0.016 points. As I mentioned, that railroad construction endogenous can depend on local economic conditions. So when I control flexibly for local railroad track in cubic polynomial, the coefficients are somewhat muted, but still large and significant. And for 1 log point increase in market access, the top 10% wealth share goes up by approximately 1.52 percentage points. So this is the main result. So increasing market access or lowering trade barriers leads to a significant increase in county level wealth inequality. So after that, I would like to move on to my second question, that to what extent the level of financial development matters for the distributional consequences of lowering trade barriers. And why would financial development be important? So financial development can be important because financial underdevelopment can limit relatively constrained poor households from taking advantage of declining trade barriers. So if financial sector is more developed, these poor households can access finance and can expand their scale of production to take advantage of these opportunities. So to study the sensitivity of wealth inequality and the role of financial development, I consider financial development at the state level, and I have three main measures: log number of banks per 100,000 people, log per capita bank loans, and log per capita bank capital. And then I run the same regression, but I also interact market access with the financial development at the initial level. So I do this for two reasons. First, it has been shown that railroads can come in and they can increase the level of financial development. And also financial development can also affect the level of inequality in the county. So to avoid these concerns and reverse causality concerns, I basically fix the financial development at the existing level, at the baseline level, and study how does it matter. And in all specifications, this interaction term enters negatively, which suggests that for a given increase in market access, the areas where financial sector is more developed, the effect on inequality is somewhat muted. So let me just summarize my empirical results. So what do I find empirically? Empirically, I find that railroads reduce the cost of shipping goods significantly, and this decline in trade costs led to a considerable increase in real estate wealth inequality. And second, I also find that this increase in inequality is relatively less in areas where banks are better or banks give out more loans, or there are more number of banks available. Of course, there are so many concerns with this data because civil war is in my sample period. There's a huge movement of population. People are moving from east to west, and also a lot of immigrants are coming from Germany, from Ireland, from outside US, and things are changing drastically. And I show that results are robust to all these considerations. And finally, I also show that when I consider other measures of financial development, results hold. So for example, my baseline is real estate wealth inequality, but if instead I consider personal wealth inequality as my main outcome variable, results hold up. And as another measure of real estate wealth inequality, I also consider concentration of farm ownership as a measure of inequality. What I mean by concentration of farm ownership, the share of very large farms in total acreage in the county goes up with higher market access, and the share of relatively small and medium farms goes down. So it suggests that large landowners or rich people benefit more as opposed to relatively small ones. So this is my empirical analysis. So to rationalize these findings that lower trade barriers lead to an increase in wealth inequality, I write a small open economy model. And I also use the model to study the effect of financial development. And to do so, I consider counterfactual economies with changing level of financial development. I consider a frictionless economy. I also consider an economy with financial development that is at the current level. So this small open economy has 4 key features, as I mentioned before. Number 1 is heterogeneous households, and these households differ in their entrepreneurial productivity. Please note that this is somewhat different than standard workhorse model in macro, where idiosyncratic differences arise because of labor productivity differences. Previous work has shown that models with only labor income productivity are not able to generate this thick tail of wealth distribution. Wealth distribution tend to be highly concentrated, and the models with entrepreneurship are able to generate realistic wealth distributions. And since my goal is to study the effect of trade cost on wealth inequality, it is imperative that I generate realistic wealth distributions. So to do so, this brings to my second point. Second point is occupational choice. So households can choose to become entrepreneurs. by paying a per period fixed cost of production, or they can choose to remain workers. Number 3, there is trade with the rest of the country. So in this small open economy, households or entrepreneurial households can choose to become exporters, and they can start shipping outside and supply to the rest of the country. And finally, fourth feature is—
Dheeraj, just a clarification question in the chat. In looking at the effects of how the effects of market access vary with financial development being defined in 1850, there's a question about how much that might be absorbed by the county fixed effect. But is the idea that the financial development in 1850 is interacted with the effect of market access, and so that's why it's not absorbed by the county fixed effect? Is that right?
Yes, it's the latter. Yes.
Okay, great. All right, just wanted to clarify.
And I also let me make it clear. So one might be concerned that this financial development is capturing effects of urbanization or higher population. I also interacted with other control variables, and the results still go through.
Okay, great, thanks.
So the final feature of the model is financial frictions, and I modeled them as collateral constraints. Basically, you need a certain amount of land to produce more output, and the amount of land that you can rent is limited by the amount of wealth you have. So this is a small open economy, which is filled with a continuum of households of measure 1. And there are 2 sectors in this economy: intermediate goods sector and the final goods sector. In the intermediate goods sector, there are 2 varieties: local varieties and outside varieties. Local varieties are produced by households who choose to become entrepreneurs, and outside varieties are produced by the rest of the country, and they are imported in this small open economy. And intermediate goods sector entrepreneurs engage in monopolistic competition, and these varieties are tradable. That is, they can be exported, they can be imported. And the final goods sector is, there's a representative producer in that sector, and that combines domestic and outside varieties in a CES aggregator. And the final good is non-tradable and is used for consumption and for investment. So let me now describe the household and entrepreneur block. So this is the most important block of the model. Basically, all the action happens here. Preferences are very standard. There's nothing special about them, standard CRRA preferences. So the occupational choice model. So every household is endowed with 1 unit of labor supply that it supplies inelastically at a wage W that would be determined in general equilibrium. Each household can also choose to produce a differentiated variety by paying a per period fixed cost, FT, in terms of labor units. And the production technology is Cobb-Douglas, where production is done using land and labor. And ZIT is the idiosyncratic entrepreneurial productivity, and that varies according to an AR1 process. So this is somewhat a different feature. Land is the only asset in this economy, and it can be accumulated. And land is not assumed in fixed supply. This is because in 19th century US, raw land is available in abundant supply and can be converted into more productive land. And in particular, I find that from 1850 to 1880, the amount of productive land increased in the US in everywhere, even in the Northeast. The productive land increased by approximately 40%. So to do that, I do not put an upper limit on this thing. Why do I do that? It helps me avoiding one state variable, that is the price of the land. So that helps me in computation of the solution. And asset accumulation equation is simply the tomorrow's asset would be today's asset plus whatever income you get from labor and from entrepreneurial activity minus what you consume. So also note that there is no capital. So if I can assume that land capital is subsumed in this land, but if there is no cost of switching, then you can assume that this is subsumed in this one. So what are the demand curves faced by—
just a heads up, by the way, about 10 minutes.
Okay, thank you. So all these entrepreneurs face a CES demand. So the final goods sector combines these varieties using a CES aggregator. So these entrepreneurs face a downward sloping CES demand curve from the domestic final goods sector. And I also assume that the demand curve faced by these entrepreneurs from the outside sector is also takes a similar functional form. These entrepreneurs can choose to export, and exporting has two kinds of cost. One is fixed cost in terms of labor units, and second is iceberg trade cost, that is to ship one unit somewhere into like ship more than one unit, because some of it will be lost in shipping. So what are financial markets? Financial markets is like there's a representative intermediary that can pools all the assets obtained from the households and lends them out to entrepreneurs at a rental rate RT, which would be determined in general equilibrium. Entrepreneurs face a working capital constraint. That is, they can choose to rent LT amount of land to produce, but the amount that they can rent is limited by the amount of wealth they have, lambda. So lambda represents the level of financial development in the economy. If lambda is equal to 1, it suggests financial autarky. You can only use the wealth you have to produce. And if lambda is infinity, you can borrow as much as you want to produce. So to just suggest how do financial frictions matter, let me just show you this graph. In this graph, on y-axis there's assets, and on the horizontal axis there's productivity. And for the state space, I show you who choose to become exporters, who choose to become workers, and who choose to become non-exporter. Productivity is an important determinant for where you end up, like in standard Mallet model, but in standard models, assets are not important because of no financial frictions. But when you are financially constrained, these decisions can also depend on household wealth. So for a given productivity, only rich households can choose to become entrepreneurs or exporters. For example, you can notice at this point, you are very highly productive, but you still choose to become non-exporter as opposed to exporters because of you are not profitable after paying all the fixed costs. So financial frictions can alter the number of entrepreneurs and number of exporters by pricing out relatively poor households. Financial frictions also affect households on the intensive margin. So in this figure, in the blue dotted line suggests output for high wealth households, and red line suggests output for low wealth households. So after you hit your borrowing constraint, you can only increase your production by hiring more labor as opposed to land. And since you're increasing your production by hiring only one input, you are subject to decreasing returns. So you start producing less. So for the same productivity, like at a certain like high level, low wealth households produce less as opposed to wealthy households. Now I show you about calibrations. Calibration is, this part is standard. Everything is borrowed from literature. For the second part, I calibrate 7 model parameters to match 7 moments in the data. And for this calibration, I'm able to generate the model moments that are very much in line with the data. I don't have time to go much in the detail about the calibration procedure, but let me show you how the model does in terms of non-targeted moments. In the calibration, I only targeted aggregate level wealth inequality measures, but the model is able to generate the wealth distribution more broadly. The top 10% wealth share in the model is 67% data. The model is also able to generate the wealth distribution for only truncated distribution, where I limit the sample to only positive wealth households. The model is also does well in reproducing the income distribution. So this should give you some confidence in the model. So next thing I also do is that the model does not only behave well in steady state, the model also does well in terms of what happens when you hit the model with a shock. So what I do in this figure is I study the impact of trade cost decline in the model and in the data both, and along the wealth distribution. So I study what happens when market access goes up. So when market access goes up in the empirics, in the blue line, I show that the top 10% wealth share goes up, top 5% wealth share goes up, and the wealth share held by other deciles go down. And then I run the similar regressions in the model. And to do that, I back out a change in iceberg trade cost that is consistent with the same 1 log point increase in model market access. And I find that for the same amount of shock, the model does reasonably well in reproducing these patterns. So this is the model validation exercise. I have 5 minutes. Let me just quickly show you two counterfactuals. I run two counterfactuals in this paper. So first counterfactual is simply what happens when you feed in the empirically observed decline in trade costs. So since my analysis, empirical analysis that with n regions, so to calibrate this one region small open economy with this n region market access, what I do is I calculate a population weighted average market access for the national economy. And from 1850 to 1870, it goes up by approximately 0.55 log points. And then I feed in this change in market access. And for model implied change in market access, I can back out a change in tau. And I find that for this change in tau, the lowering, basically trade costs go down from tau 3.2 to tau 2.7. And I find that lowering trade costs lead to an increase in income and in wealth both. And this increase in income and wealth comes at the cost of higher wealth inequality. The wealth top 10% goes up by approximately 2.1 percentage point. Income top 10% goes up and wealth Gini goes up. So, and in terms of magnitude, I find that for this empirically observed decline in trade cost, the wealth top 10% goes up by approximately 2.1 percentage points. And during the same time period, the real estate wealth top 10% increased by 3.4 percentage point. So this decline in trade cost can explain about 60% of the empirically observed increase in wealth inequality between 1850 and 1870. Let me show you my second counterfactual. What I do in second counterfactual is I consider different economies, and what I do, I change the level of financial development. So the first counterfactual is where I consider an economy that has same features as my baseline economy. The only difference is the level of financial development is increased to the current level, where basically the credit to asset ratio is at the United States now, which is basically 0.34. And in the second counterfactual, I consider a frictionless economy. Basically, there is no borrowing constraint, there's no collateral constraint. And I find that as you increase the level of financial development in the economy, the increase in income and wealth goes up, and the increase in inequalities gets muted. So if you look at wealth top 10%, in baseline economies goes up by 3% or 2.1 percentage point. And in the frictionless economy, it only goes up by 0.53%. So this suggests that this 0.53% comes directly from a Melitz kind of mechanism, and the rest of it can be accounted by financial frictions that are faced by relatively poor households. So I have 1 minute, so let me just conclude. So what I do in this paper, I use a large-scale natural experiment and the universe of wealth data from 1850 to 1870, and I show that railroads reduce the trade costs, and these lower trade costs increase wealth inequality in the US. And for mechanisms, I find that one mechanism is that there's a reallocation towards more productive and wealthier households after trade costs go down. And I also find that financial frictions faced by relatively poor households exacerbate the effect of declining trade barriers on wealth inequality. And in conclusion, I would like to point out that lowering trade barriers lead to higher growth, but this growth comes at the cost of higher inequality. Thank you so much.
Great, thanks a lot. So a couple of questions in the chat. So the first question is about geographic mobility. And so how are you thinking about the mobility of entrepreneurs or just people generally across counties, and how those moving costs might vary across space?
So in the model, it's only one region model, so there is no population movement. For the empirics, it's a big issue because people can come with lots of wealth, can move from Germany, say, with lots of wealth, and change the distribution of wealth, and they can come poor and increase inequality. So to do so, I simply focus on people who were already there, non-migrants, and calculate inequality among them. So it's not a perfect measure, but I also find that even if you calculate inequality for non-migrants, it also goes up significantly. So that's one way I tackle it. And other ways are also doing it, but they're not perfect with directly controlling for migrant share and other things. But I think only calculating inequality using non-migrants.
You mean non-immigrants?
Yeah, non-migrants, because I'm calling because like it could be also from like east to west movement. So I'm also excluding those people who might move from New York to Iowa, say, for example.
But I guess, how do you know if somebody is somebody in 1860 or 1870? How do you know if they were there in 1850?
So I do not know if they were in 1850, but I know their birth state. So okay. I know every individual where they were born, not the county of the birth, but I know their birth state. So I can exclude people who were not born in the same state at least.
Okay. Yeah, I guess a follow-up question that I had about mobility is that it seems like one way to interpret what you're doing and what you're estimating is you're estimating the impact on wealth inequality in a place. And whether market access and decreasing transportation costs are making places themselves have more or less wealth inequality, which I think is a little bit distinct from sort of what's the impact on wealth inequality sort of overall in the country, or what's the impact of wealth inequality on people that would include those people that are moving across places. Because there's a long tradition of thinking about how, the railroads opened up this Western frontier. It allowed people, often poorer people from the East to move to the West and sort of seek out this opportunity, get land, sort of create this agricultural life for themselves. And so, yeah, I guess in some sense, if it's sort of creating these opportunities for people moving out West and allowing for the formation of new counties, I think of that as sort of somewhat opposite to sort of an established land aristocracy in the East. And so, these new counties, as market access increases, they might have high wealth inequality. They might have high growing inequality within that county, but the sort of overall movement is sort of tempering wealth inequality or inequality at like a national kind of scale.
So I think you're absolutely right. And this is a concern I also have. So basically, to put it more simply, you can just think of it as a within versus between decomposition. So right now, what I'm doing is kind of like taking care of that within component, that what happens within counties. So what I'm planning to do is extend the model to at least 2 or 3 regions and try to study this spillovers that come from migrating population to what happens this between component and thus aggregate inequality. So ideally, I would want to have an end region model, but with this kind of heterogeneity, it's like becomes nearly impossible to solve that end region model. But I'm at least hoping to write a 2 region or 3 region model to account for these population spillovers where people move to opportunities and thus change the distribution of wealth.
Yeah, and I think some of it would just be, given the paper that you've written and the analysis you've done, it would be just sort of clarifying the interpretation and sort of like, what do these estimates mean and what are they saying about wealth inequality in these places, and how might that be distinct from the way it's affecting sort of national economic opportunities and sort of wealth inequality, at a broader cross-county scale.
Okay, thank you.
All right, so another question in the chat about how you're modeling land accumulation. And so the question is that it looked like 1 saved unit of consumption good led to 1 unit of developed land. Yes. But how do we think about sort of the introduction of new land essentially into the ecosystem as the government's moving land from the public domain into the private sector?
So the government sold a lot of land in the United States, but this land was sold at a very, very cheap rate, like almost at like sometimes even $1.25 per acre. And estimates suggest that sometimes prices actually went even below that. So the most of land clearing and other costs like accounted for majority of the cost when you want to like make raw land to abundant land. So not the land selling price. So this is where I make a simplifying assumption that like 1 unit of output is directly cost you to make 1 extra unit of land. And I'm thinking of those land selling at $1 as like approximately 0. And since ideally there is no way of like, there is no like one constant estimate of making land more productive. So that's where assumption is somewhat more simplifying. I can have a land price, but like I would struggle to like calibrate it reasonably well. Again, I would be calibrating to somewhat more ad hoc thing. which would not add much to it.
Yeah, I guess a follow-up question I had to that is the way that I was thinking about it is that sort of in my paper with Donaldson, we estimate the impact on land values. And so, land itself is sort of getting, the way we think about it is that there's sort of a fixed amount of land in a county, like total geographic land in the county, but that land itself is just getting more valuable as market access increases with some elasticity. And I guess what you're thinking about is that, okay, as land is getting more valuable, what's the allocation of that land and sort of who owns that? And is that ownership effectively, is that share of value effectively getting more concentrated, or is the share of value, expanding?
You can think of it that way. And you can also think of it, so in your paper, you find that in your empirical analysis, you find that a part of it comes from land extending, and part of it comes from changes in prices, if I remember correctly, your paper. And if I do the same analysis for my sample, which is basically 20 years before you, I find that most of the change comes from land extension rather than price appreciation. So amount of productive land in almost all counties increase, and the prices do not go up as much during my sample, probably because more raw land is available to convert as opposed to.
Yeah, I find it difficult though to think about this, like decomposing the effect into sort of land expansion versus land value, because the increasing land that's getting settled is potentially less valuable land inherently. It's sort of the parts of the county that are less valuable. And so that's why I guess we've never thought about sort of looking at land per farm acre. We always think about it as land per county acre because it's that amount of total land in the county that's fixed. Okay. But let me go to Rui. You have a question?
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Dheeraj. Great paper. Lots of work and information here. I have a couple of questions, and I don't know if they're very substantive or I was distracted. So the first one is about your identification assumption, right? So you correctly, I assume, point out that most variation in market access comes from not the county itself, but its surrounding or potentially all the counties. But did you check that by crafting some kind of IV, right? So this reminds me of the literature on networks, right? So, and of course, railways are networks by construction, right? And there's this IV strategy where you use your neighbors' outcomes as your instrument, right? So did you try doing that? Otherwise, we all know the alternative ways of creating IVs for transportation networks, straight lines and so on. And the other question, so I understand why, you wanted to introduce financial development in your paper, in a sense to see, whether it carried part of the effect, whether it was a mechanism. But I was worried that it could also be a case of bad control, right? Because it might introduce a collider bias. Because financial development, as you yourself mentioned, was also reactive to the transportation network in probably double causality ways. So by controlling for something that was also being caused by the transportation network, aren't you introducing a collider bias? So those are my questions. Thanks.
So for IV, I try what Rick also tries in his paper, basically trying to instrument for market access total by existing waterway market access. So I find same results as like results are consistent, but they also argue that this is not the best IV in this because US railroad network is very dense. So results hold, but I also agree with them that that's one thing. Second, for financial development, this is one reason I basically started the initial level of financial development in 1850, where railroad network is somewhat more limited and only exists in the northeast of the United States. So I could have the financial development varying over time, but then that will have lots of these issues. So for this, I use it as an initial level. And especially I think it's okay to use an initial level because railroad network is limited. So I don't think that before 1850, they are driving the financial development, especially because before 1850, railroads were primarily used to carry passengers. And after only 1850, the trade kind of overweight the passenger travel for railroads.
No, I understand, right? And I know that you use the initial level financial development, right? But financial development doesn't happen randomly, right? So and you couldn't build the railway line immediately either, right? So, call it anticipation effects, right? So could you have predicted the distribution of the banking industry in the US from the transportation network in the 1850s or vice versa, right? Is there a way of thinking about this?
I've not thought about this, but I'll thank you so much. I'll think about this.
Yeah, I think a related question I had was in looking at this heterogeneous impact by financial development is sort of just other things that might vary with these measures of financial development, things like how agricultural the place was, whether the place has slavery, whether the place varies along other sorts of characteristics. I partly as sort of potential confounding factors for financial development, but also just partly as I think there's just other interesting margins of heterogeneity, how the effects on wealth inequality might vary with these places' characteristics. But I think just like other general questions or comments I had, so you focus on the impacts on wealth inequality, and I guess I was interested in sort of putting that together with the absolute impacts on growth in these places and trying to understand what were the absolute gains for lower income or lower wealth people, because there's such large gains on average that, even if inequality is going up, I guess I would think about that inequality going up differently if it's sort of lower income, lower wealth people are still benefiting substantially versus, if lower income, lower wealth people are being shut out of the economy and actually losing to some degree, despite the increase in wealth that's going up. And one thing, so moving more on from my paper with Donaldson to my newer work with Martin Rotenberg, we find that those gains are especially large when you allow for frictions in the economy. So when you allow for some distortion in input usage, then there's even larger gains from market integration. And so these places that have less financial development, while they might have more of an increase in inequality, they're also going to have much larger economic gains because the marginal value of inputs is substantially greater than the marginal cost of inputs in those economies, precisely because of those financial frictions. And so I was kind of interested to think more about what those gains might be for people when these opportunities come in.
Okay, so let me just say the first part, confounding factors. So I try to interact like financial development with the population, with urbanization share, so that they are not capturing effect of those. But I agree with there might be other heterogeneous features of the economy that I can exploit to understand it better. So thank you for that comment. In terms of frictions and not frictions in terms of like effect across the distribution, although I find that inequality goes up, I indeed find that people benefit broadly across the board. So rich people benefit because they can start exporting and as such, but at the same time, poor people benefit because this leads to an increase in wages. So, and most of their incomes comes from wages, so they also benefit. So let me just show you. This is the welfare gains from declaring trade cost. And I find that welfare goes for all households. It also goes for workers by a lot because workers, all income comes from wages. So they're able to consume more when trade costs go down. And similarly, exporters also benefit. Only in the model, some non-exporters lose because they used to be entrepreneurs before railroads arrived. And now the railroads come, and since they're not very productive, they are pushed out of entrepreneurship and they become workers. So, but their losses are very modest. And even among non-exporters, the gains are still positive. So
yeah, this is somewhere also where I thought it would be interesting to allow for non-real estate wealth. And maybe try to model more explicitly what's going to show up in real estate wealth versus what's going to show up in other assets and other wealth. So one of the things that I emphasize in the paper with Rotenberg is that the paper with Donaldson emphasized the economic gains being capitalized in land values, but when you have financial frictions, there's going to be a lot of increases in sort of county surplus that aren't capitalized in land values. And so part of that is going to be looking at like firm profits and just sort of other surplus that people get that's not going to show up in real estate wealth. And so I thought that would be something interesting to develop along with, ideally, it'd be nice to have capital in production especially given your emphasis on the role that financial frictions play, it'd be nice to think about like capital distortions. And that's potentially one other way that you could measure financial development in counties, rather than using the presence of banks or banks per capita or things like that. You could kind of use my work with Rotenberg, and look at, well, what's the magnitude of the capital distortion across counties? And so there's some counties that have larger capital wedges and some counties have smaller capital wedges. And maybe that could be a useful proxy for the level of financial development across counties.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Like, that's a very good suggestion. I've not thought about that. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, Nathan.
Hi, Raj. I enjoyed the paper. I have a question, kind of more of in the line, along the line of what Rick was saying. So, do you precondition on initial, say, wealth inequality? Because you see the percent. I mean, inequality was extremely high. So we're not talking about an equal society which is being disturbed by some kind of a technological shock. So it was very high. So is there some difference as to the starting point? So counties that were more unequal experienced higher growth rate, higher. So obviously you don't capture in the model, but something with the data, just to see if there's some, because you could precondition, say, on existing banks, but getting rid of some, you're lumping everything in fixed effects, but it would be interesting along the same, exploit some heterogeneity, as we were saying, with some of the intra-county type of comparisons.
Yeah, I've done that, but I've done that like 1 year ago, interaction with the initial level of inequality, but I really can't remember right now what those results were, because I did not like really believe in that specification that much. So I tried the specification like 1 year back, but I can get back to you like what old results were. I don't remember at the moment right now.
Yeah, I would find it interesting. The other thing, just in terms of positioning the paper, so obviously there's some temptation to position this as the effect of globalization, increasing trade on inequality. But I think as the discussion shows, and you show in the paper, there's these trade expansion effects, and then there's the substitution effects and all these kind of negative side effects. But so comparing it, say, to globalization, the impact that, say, Chinese imports had on the US is maybe, again, you want to expand more on kind of the levels of wealth that are increasing for everyone. And then there's this some kind of a negative outcome in the end, but the overall is a creation of trade, more land, migration. So it's kind of an expanding economy. It's not a shrinking. It's not like the substitution effect is not the dominant one, I think.
Okay, yeah. Thank you. I agree with that.
Yeah. One thing you mentioned in the presentation is that wealthier households were the most productive entrepreneurs that would benefit the most from railroads. And I guess I found that surprising in the discussion of it in some way, because it seems like the wealthier households might just be those that are least subject to those financial constraints. And so, in places with more finance, it might be that sort of there's very productive but less wealthy people, that can then benefit. And so I guess with financial frictions, I often think about people with less wealth as being marginally more productive. And maybe that's what's kind of driving some of your results, that these less wealthy but more productive people can take advantage of these opportunities from market access. And that's why, inequality doesn't go up by as much, or inequality might, go down to some degree.
Yeah, that's right. Like the point, on average, like you would, even with financial frictions, like on average, like the richer people would be somewhat more productive in steady states, in steady state, but you would still have like enough like really productive people with low wealth who just end up with a bad draw productivity show over time. So
yeah, I guess you're inferring that people are productive from the fact that they are wealthy. And I guess I'm thinking about people maybe more at the beginning of their life cycle, where there might be somebody that's productive, but just hasn't had a chance yet to build up wealth. Because I think of this as a very young economy. It's a very frontier economy, with people that are moving to these places, and these counties themselves, the ones that are experiencing the most market access growth, are experiencing big inflows of population. And so, yeah, it's a very kind of dynamic, growing place with these young people, is how I think about it more.
Yeah, so I think like when I extend to 2-region model, at least 3-region model, then I think like I can capture these things really well. So some of these things are very limited, like as Nathan also mentioned, that is like not a constant economies, like constantly growing economy, extending economy. So I think with the two region model, I can like capture some of these features better, which right now I don't have in the model.
Yeah. Okay, so timing wise, so that's noon. So that's like the core initial portion of the seminar. So thanks everyone for coming. But we're also, for those of you that want, you can stick around for 15 minutes or so, and people can unmute themselves and ask other questions as well. But thanks so much. And just an announcement, I guess, for next week. So be sure to come next week for the seminar by Davide Cantoni on the rise of fiscal capacity. And so, yep, for those of you that are leaving now, see you next week in the seminar. All right, thanks a lot. And thanks a lot to Dheeraj for the presentation.
Thank you, Rick. I'll wait for more questions.
Yeah, so we can open it up more generally if people just want to unmute themselves. Any other kind of lingering questions? I guess as people are thinking about that, one thing I wanted to mention is I think one of the ways you kind of motivated your paper is being distinct from the literature that's generally focused on income inequality and how income inequality is affected by trade is that your data is sort of unusually rich in being able to look at wealth inequality. And I thought that was something that maybe you could push on more in exploring, well, what are the differences between wealth inequality and income inequality, and why might we expect wealth inequality to change differently than income inequality? And you're kind of thinking about wealth as just sort of reflecting some stream of built up income, but there's maybe reasons why you might expect wealth inequality would respond differently to trade shocks than income inequality. And that could both clarify what you're doing in the analysis and maybe also highlight the contribution from being able to look at wealth as distinct from income.
Yes, so one reason I think of it as being different is basically because of financial frictions. Like, so one could argue that like increasing income would automatically be translated to more wealth over time. So why should we even care about income inequality? So that's where the financial frictions kind of matter, that like they make the transmission somewhat nonlinear across the distribution. So that's one. And also other reasons are basically wealth inequality can have like more severe consequences for the economy, as a lot of historical work has shown that they limit the restriction of financial development and they restrict the public good provision and other things. So for outcome-wise, wealth inequality can have much more severe consequences. That's one. And one thing is that like a lot of the income inequality debate is kind of driven by the change in skill composition, or basically like increase in skill premium, which is not the main mechanism here. Is kind of like more entrepreneurial income is like important like transmission factor in this my analysis, as opposed to labor income, which is distinct by skill composition. But I think you're right. I need to like think more clearly and like just put this as a concrete argument to say why should we focus more on wealth. And this is the first paper, so like this is an important contribution.
Yeah, and especially given that you're focused on real estate wealth in particular, I think there is some work that looks at the railroads and land concentration, especially because of the ways that the railroads themselves were funded by subsidizing land and giving land in this checkerboard pattern to the railroad companies themselves. And then those railroad companies sold off those lands in the private market. I think there's some work.
I think you mentioned to me Corey Smith is at Maryland.
Yeah.
I met him. Yeah, like so he kind of like studies the long run implications of that.
Yeah, and so it reminds me a little bit more then of some of the literature on like land redistribution and kind of land concentration and inequality in those sorts of respects, because the way that the railroads were kind of built locally, it potentially locally affected this sort of distribution of land itself. And I think you get away from that some when you start to control for local railroad construction and you use the sort of variation of market access that's distinct from the construction of railroads themselves. But that's something that's floating out there as well.
And also their analysis at the count, like, so I think Corey's thing is that like you get these checkerboard patterns at like for 1 mile. Since I'm looking at the county, I kind of like capture everything in that. They're like 1 mile of like a railroad block and then 1 mile of like more individual houses or individual land. So if I do county level, I kind of like takes this concentration, which becomes like more equal as this county was this county. Because half the land in railroads, how the land goes to individuals.
Yeah, Bayless.
Yes, thank you very much for this very interesting paper. I wanted to come back, sorry, to my obsession about mobility. And so you mentioned keeping only non-migrant people also being born in the same states, but for example, so I'm currently in Pennsylvania, and it's a huge state. So if you're born in one country from this, and then you move to Philadelphia, how does this enter your model? Because if you measure, and I guess it's come back a little bit to Rui's question about the neighbor effect. So if you're neighboring Philadelphia and then you see development and you move to Philadelphia, and then could you capture this in your railroad? And that would be actually a mobility issue, or what can you, how can you deal with such a situation? Like so, intrastate mobility.
Yeah, I can, I like that's the limitation. I cannot like capture people who move, say, within Pennsylvania, because I have no way of identifying those people. The only way I can identify that, like if they are born in some other state. So that's one limitation I think I would concede to, because it could be the case that you're moving towards like Western Pennsylvania, which is like somewhat more empty, and it might change the distribution, but I cannot like identify those people. So that's.
And do you have like anecdotal evidence about how mobile were people, and if cost of moving in, moving out was important? Maybe they didn't move so much, or maybe they were moving a lot. I have no idea what it was in this period in the US. So maybe if you can have some more like historical evidence on what it were, that would be helpful.
Yeah, so labor mobility is very high. That part is shown before in the literature, but I'm not sure about intrastate versus interstate mobility. So how much like intrastate mobility is there, but overall mobility is very, very high.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I come back. so Irash, I guess in many of these states, what you call entrepreneurs are actually farmers, right? Family farming units.
Yeah, you could think of the family farming units and then like going up.
At least on the border, right? So is there data on type of real estate wealth, or it just says real estate? Can you distinguish farm wealth? Can you find some kind of proxy for that?
So I have like one proxy. So they all census also classifies your occupation. So they tell you like it is like farm wealth or non-farm wealth. Then I also calculate inequality between those sectors. I think of non-farm as basically manufacturing, like it could be services also, but like I find that like inequality goes up even if you look at like farm sector or non-farm sector, it goes up. It goes somewhat more in the manufacturing as opposed to agriculture, because you would expect these effects of trade to be somewhat higher in the manufacturing sector, because differentiation is much, much higher. So trade would be somewhat more important in that. But I find that inequality goes up even within the farm sector.
Okay, so you can account for what I wanted, and so you observe overall increase in inequality, but it's stronger in the non-farm sector.
Somewhat, like not like difference is like not huge, but it's like somewhat higher.
Okay, and since you've mentioned it, could that be related to what someone asked earlier on the access to subsidized or almost free public land? Right, so there's no freebies if you want to set up a plant, right? Whereas you could actively move to a state that would guarantee you access to land with very little capital requirement.
But even that land that was given away, it was not like the empty land, right? You were given a chunk of forest, basically. You'd like step to go and clear it out. So even if you're starting a agricultural farm or you're starting a manufacturing small firm, I think the setting up cost would somewhat be similar in that regard.
Okay, so maybe my view of the US in this time is too much stated by House on the Prairie, right? But I thought that most of what happened in those frontier farms was that the family did the whole work, right? So it was intra-household work rather than, but yeah. Maybe.
No, you can do it on your own, but still like it ends up being very costly. So estimates range from around $11. So land, so Homestead Act land was sold at like $1.25 per acre. And the estimates for land clearing range from around $11 to $25 per acre. So it's like substantially larger than the cost of just like buying the land. it could be prairie clearing, it could be like just like cutting down trees and other things. And it might vary like significantly geographically, but I don't know about how much it varies in different areas.
Yeah, I think that story also, it's interesting how much it becomes the story the further west that you move. And so, there's a really nice history book by Webb that talks about this, that sort of in the eastern United States, these smaller parcels of land were quite valuable. And in the sort of in the eastern parts that were settled under the Homestead Act, these 160-acre farms were quite valuable that they got. But then as you moved more westward through the country, 160 acres was really substantially below the kind of minimum operating scale that you needed to really succeed. And the Homestead Act was more of a trap than really like a valuable asset that people were getting. And that's why in part they modified these land acts to become 320 acres or 640 acres that you were able to settle. So yeah, it's probably a different project, but yeah, I think that geographic heterogeneity and how land got settled across places, would be interesting.
That's also like one concern I have, like, because there's one mechanism which is very apparent, like, but I have no way of checking it. It could be the case that rich people own the more productive land, or basically in the center of the land, and poor people like reside on the periphery of the county, let's say. And even if their expansion is about the same amount, the appreciation might be heterogeneous across rich versus poor people. And that could be another mechanism through which inequality might go up, depending on the land quality you own. So, but I don't know, like, if you know of any reference where I can like check for this, but like, this is like one potential mechanism, which is kind of like also relates to the modern literature in macro asset pricing, right? Like asset gains are different across house distribution. So that's one thing, like, I'm like somewhat concerned about, like the same point somewhat. Yeah.
If I can come back to the initial wealth, I mean, again, I'm looking at that. I tried to look at the paper to find some summary statistics or some distributional tables or anything. But so you have these railways as a treatment, right? And then you have counties with banks and counties without banks initially. So is wealth inequality different between the two of them significantly? So I don't see any kind of balancing or anything to see if that's because the idea that financial development or banking reduces the effect, the sort of doesn't reduce, but it's offsetting some of the inequality. Could be that those places that if you're kind of a believer of the negative effects of financial development on wealth accumulation, the Piketty things, and so you would think that places with banks before might, not the friction part, I mean, talk about the not the friction role of banks, but the wealth accumulation, then it could be that these places that had banks before were more unequal before, and or less unequal. I don't know. I mean, that's something that is missing, like in terms of trying to see where the mechanics of this are coming from and how financial development really impacts it. Is just the frictions? Is a proxy for the initial wealth distribution? Is some condition? It's like a proxy for the initial wealth. So that's kind of, and then you would say the higher it was, like in those growth regression, the higher you start, the less would be the percentage growth or something when you're starting from a high base. Any one of these things kind of still bothers me.
Yes. So what I can tell you is like it's somewhat banking is like somewhat more skewed towards Northeast. So there are like lots of banks in the Northeast, and there are some banks in the South which get decimated during Civil War, and Western United States is almost empty. There are banks in the Midwest, but not as much as in the Northeast. So this I can tell you about the bank distribution across the country. And I can also tell you that like a number of banks are not capturing for initial level of wealth or initial level of urbanization or initial level of population. They might be capturing for something else that like I'm not accounting for. They're not capturing for these variables that you mentioned. But like, again, it's not like perfect answer, but like I can check that like what can they proxying be for, but they're not proxying for anything very standard that we think of.
Okay. All right.
Great. Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot for a great seminar. A lot of interesting stuff to think about. And yeah, hope we continue to be in touch. And yeah, I look forward to seeing the project develop and future stuff that you do.
Thank you so much, Rick. I'll send you my next draft whenever I'm working on it. So, but I'll send you whenever I have it.
Great.
Fantastic. Thanks, Rick. Thanks, Dheeraj.
Bye, everyone.
Yeah. Thank you, Rohit. Thank you, Nathan, like for inviting me to the seminar. It was great, like lots of feedback, lots of points to think about. Thank you so much.
Fantastic. Thanks. Good to have you. Bye then.
Thank you. Bye-bye.